Hello, and you're very welcome to the discussion we're having this afternoon with Dr. Tom Moore. Tom is the director of CK405, which is the degree in genetics. I believe, Tom, it's a BSc in genetics?
That's correct, Jean, yes.
And so what is, when somebody says, what's a degree in genetics? Can you explain?
So it's essentially a 4-year course of study. So after your leaving certificate, if you're an Irish student, there are potentially some options. If you're a foreign student, you enter into a first-year course, which is shared. Many of the modules are shared with other degree courses, other BSc courses. And that's a foundation year, which essentially brings everybody in the class up to the same level in terms of basic background knowledge in science, physics, chemistry, biology. But in addition, there are specific genetics modules which you take, which none of the other science students will take. So immediately on entry into the course, you're actually studying genetics in a small class environment. And that's what makes it maybe special or different compared to the other science degrees.
And is that human genetics?
It's essentially the foundations of genetics, which would obviously encompass human genetics, but could be applied to all living organisms, essentially, that have DNA and chromosomes.
And if you're in your Leaving Cert cycle, if you're in Ireland or in the equivalents across the world, where would your interests lie such that you choose to do a Bachelor of Science degree in genetics?
Yeah, so we get a very interesting mixture of students in genetics. I think it is definitely different to other types of science student. So it's not overly focused on, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, although many of our graduates do go in that direction ultimately. We tend to get people who have got a very active imagination, I would say, who have possibly read popular science books like The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And so I think there's quite a broad spectrum of students, but I think they are distinguished by being very inquisitive and curious, which is really a hallmark of the type of student that we want in genetics. Genetics has always led, certainly for the last 100 years or so, many of the biological sciences. And the more applied aspects, a lot of those have come from genetics, for example, in medical genetics. But I think our students are very much curiosity driven. That would be my feeling.
And what would you do with a degree in genetics?
Nowadays, I guess, when you come out the other end after 4 years of study, many BSc graduates do a master's degree. And that's a stepping stone and really an opportunity for further specialization. So you can turn left, right, or go straight ahead, essentially, once you exit the degree. And you can meet up with cohorts of students that might have studied biochemistry or microbiology or other types of BScs. So I think you have a very broad spectrum of outlets in terms of employment or further study once you've completed the 4-year basic undergraduate degree. But you are qualified for pure genetics in a way that perhaps the other BScs wouldn't be.
And continuing on that, who would employ somebody who did a degree in pure genetics?
So at the moment, there is huge excitement around genetics because, for the first time ever, we've got really high quality, high throughput DNA sequencing technologies. So literally every genome on the planet is going to be sequenced, ultimately, and possibly in a relatively short time scale. Bacteria, viruses, mammals, and of course humans. And we're not far off the point where every single human patient will have their full genomic DNA sequence available for their doctor to examine, for example. So medical geneticists are employed widely in the pharmaceutical industry, for further research and education institutes. They're involved in animal breeding, they're involved in ecology, and biotechnology, so engineering organisms to produce, for example, novel enzymes. So there's really an extremely wide spectrum of outlets for the pure geneticist or the molecular geneticist, in addition to the more standard outlets such as, the pharmaceutical industry, production related topics, etc. Another aspect that I should mention is that in relation to medical genetics, there's a burgeoning field of genetic counseling. So now that we have a lot more information about our genomes, we need people who can actually advise the general public and patients on the implications of having a particular genetic test in terms of their future health.
So when somebody is studying genetics, if we go back again into the 4-year degree, what subjects do they take?
So the first 2 years would be those foundation years that I've mentioned already: physics, chemistry, maths, biology, but in addition, quite specific genetics modules. And then as you move through third and fourth year, there's an increasing array of specialized genetics modules which are taken. In addition, then there are various projects, literature review project in third year, and a laboratory-based research project in fourth year. So the pattern is similar to other BScs in the sciences, the basic structure of the degree. And indeed, right throughout the 4 years, you would be sharing classes with other BSc classes, such as biochemistry and microbiology. But you would also have those specialized degrees. And in fourth year, about half of the study time is pure specific genetics modules.
And then the research that goes on between you and your academic colleagues in the department.
In terms of genetics, the human genome sequence was a key milestone in the mid-1990s. And of course, that has expanded dramatically. Now we've got literally hundreds of thousands of genomes from multiple organisms to analyze. So bioinformatics, handling large data sets, computing, statistics, those are all really important aspects of modern genetics as well. It doesn't mean that you need to have a high achieving background in maths as you enter the degree, because the mathematical components would be, firstly you would learn them along the way, but they're more applied. So there are lots of computer programs that make handling that type of data and the ensuing analysis, quite doable for the sort of general science student.
So if we go back again, the student is going through, exposed to all this wonderful research and interesting subjects and material and so on. In terms of preparing them then for the world of employment, I mean, we pride ourselves on work-ready and world-ready graduates. So are there employability skills incorporated in the program? Or do they acquire them in a co-curricular or extracurricular manner?
So we have got, in a typical genetics class, we've got, in addition to, everybody is bright in a genetics class because the points are reasonably high. But we often have people who are extremely high achieving students by any measure. And they often, enter programs, for example, after third year during the summer studentships, they can compete for quite prestigious opportunities to work in laboratories, for example, abroad in the UK or in the United States. The degree is quite strongly, I would say, research focused, but also entrepreneurial. So there are programs that some of our graduates have partaken of during their undergraduate studies, where, for example, they've set up a biotechnology company and learned skills around entrepreneurship, developed a product, learned how to market it and to pitch it, etc.
So Tom, do you have a work placement associated with the undergraduate?
So this is a key point that we should clarify. There isn't a specific work placement incorporated into the degree, because we have got quite a long fourth year research project, which is where a student partakes in a real research project in a laboratory. So that's generally around 12 weeks in length, and that's basically longer than most of the other BScs. So we focus on a research environment in genetics rather than explicitly, an industrial environment or a placement. And the reason for that is that initially in the degree, we were looking at, a high throughput of people going on to further education, PhD studies, etc. Now, in the interim, over the past few years, what we've seen is that a lot of students have expressed an interest in entrepreneurship. Essentially building their own companies or learning the concepts around that, developing a new product, learning how to market a product. And so there are opportunities for students during the summer after third year to partake in various programs, both in UCC and in other institutions that allow them to develop those skills. So genetics is quite adaptable and amenable to that type of activity, because you can manipulate DNA very readily in a way that you can't do with a standard pharmaceutical. You need a lot more technology, I guess, to build a small molecule, a typical drug, than to make a genetically modified organism that might have some use medically or in the environment, for example, breaking down waste, toxic waste. So we have a slightly different focus, but there are lots of opportunities which our students pursue. Again, going back to what I said about the typical class is very curious, very inventive. And I think we probably see a more diverse array of activities from our students going forward. They actually find their own opportunities, I would say, a lot of them, than perhaps what might be seen in some of the other BSc degrees.
So do we invite employers in to deliver guest lectures, or are we adjunct professors, or does that happen through genetics or not?
A lot of input actually from external lecturers. So for example, Teagasc Moore Park, which is a major research institute near UCC, provides specialized lectures in quantitative genetics, so animal breeding, for example. So that supports a lot of our teaching in third year, where students get access to high quality, complex quantitative genetics around the production of, production traits for high value farm animals. So that would be one aspect. We also have a lot of input in from the legal aspect. So genetic counseling, the complex ethical issues around manipulating organisms, diagnosing genetic disease in embryos, for example. So we get a lot of external input in those types of areas. In relation to more industry-related activities, so the students themselves have their own genetics society in UCC, and typically they would organize a trip, sometimes abroad or to various institutions or companies, and get input in that way from the commercial sphere. I think if you look at genetics departments in many universities in Ireland and abroad, there's often quite a narrow focus on human genetics, human clinical genetics even. And I think what UCC offers is a much broader foundation and spectrum. So genetics is a very broad subject. And UCC, although we absolutely cover the fundamental aspects and also the human genetics and the human clinical genetics, I think there are opportunities in UCC because of the strengths that UCC has in food science, in the microbiome, so the genetics of the microorganisms that inhabit our guts and which are increasingly implicated in many aspects of our bodily functions and disease. We've got the nearby major agricultural research institute, Teagasc Moor Park, and we interact with them quite substantially. So I think there are lots of broader opportunities in terms of non-human genetics that are available at UCC in terms of project supervision, for example.
And I'd imagine as well that if you have your basic degree, let's say from University College Cork, you can go on and do a master's, let's say, if you really are interested in human genetics in one
Absolutely.
of our other partner institutions in Ireland and across the world.
Absolutely. So I think the foundation that you will get in UCC in human genetics, firstly, it will equip you to call yourself a human geneticist and to work immediately in human clinical genetics. But it's almost a standard now that you would do a master's after a basic BSc degree. And that allows you then, either in Ireland or abroad, to focus more on a particular aspect, including human genetics or genetic counseling, for example.
And I think the fact that UCC would be, as you mentioned, a world leader in the whole area of food in general, and the agricultural, and our new degree in agricultural science, there's probably huge overlaps and opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, because quantitative genetics, I mean, a lot of it was actually developed and discovered in relation to animal production traits. So we've a very good understanding. We've got more genomes for Irish cattle than we do for Irish humans at the moment. So there's a lot of really interesting work, and a lot of that is associated with UCC.
Mm-hmm. Are there any myths or misconceptions associated with genetics that you'd like to dispel?
They're not all nerds. So geneticists, as I said, are if you read some of the biographies or indeed the autobiographies of geneticists, there are some astonishing people. There's a famous English geneticist from the last century, Jack Haldane, JBS Haldane, who was one of the first popularizers of science. He wrote brilliant popular science articles. He was a hero of the First World War. He had an amazing life, and he made some fundamental discoveries in genetics while he was doing all of the other stuff. He wrote a poem, a famous poem that was in the Oxford Book of English Literature. So geneticists, as I've said, are all Renaissance men and women, in my opinion. But so they have a very broad spectrum of interest, but not typically the white coated beaker of mythology, fiddling around at the lab eternally. I think a lot of geneticists spend their time out of doors, for example. Ecological genetics, would be a significant component. So I think that the environment where geneticists work is often far more interesting and exciting and varied than maybe with some of the other sciences.
And when you scan retrospectively the horizon and you look to or think of graduates that have passed through your hands there in the department, can you think of any interesting careers? I mean, any career in genetics sounds interesting, to be frank, but can you think of any career in particular you thought would be unusual, and that therefore if someone was listening to this, they would never have thought that a degree in genetics could get you there?
Yeah, well, we have, in addition to people who have gone on to significant positions in genomics companies, for example, I am familiar with several of our graduates who work in genetic counseling in the UK, for example, in hospitals, and they're dealing with patients who have got, who are from a family with an inherited disorder, and they're advising them in the context of a clinical genetics department. So there are a wide variety of outlets for a degree in genetics, and that one seems to be quite a popular one with some of our graduates.
I say there's no doubt, and it's an incredible toolkit I think, underpinning so many of the
Absolutely.
developments
Yes.
of the future.
Yeah.
And therefore an understanding from the bottom up as to how it can enable, I think, is key. And I think it's very clear from our discussion, Tom, and thank you very, very much that you've illustrated, I suppose, how interesting it is as a degree to pursue, and ultimately the employability opportunities for our graduates. So wishing you and the team continued success, and thank you very much for having this discussion.
Thank you, Jean.
Take care.
Employability and career development initiatives are delivered through curricular, co-curricular and extracurricular activities. Over 90% of our programs offer placements internationally and nationally. Throughout your time in UCC, you will have the opportunity to develop employability skills through entrepreneurship modules, skill sessions, and memberships of clubs, societies, becoming a class representative, and getting involved. Throughout your student journey, UCC Career Services will support your career planning with one-to-one career consultations and coaching. The Career Services collaborate with academic departments and other UCC units to deliver bespoke and standalone employability and career-related workshops and events for all students and recent graduates. Our annual recruitment fair is one of the largest national career fairs, featuring up to 100 top graduate employers. For more information about UCC employability initiatives and the career services, visit ucc.ie/careers.